Hello, BookTube. Well, we come to it at last. We have turned the Remuda around and we are headed back to the corral. June on the Range 2023 is now ending. This is the last day of June and one of BookTube's most popular, funnest events, June on the Range, created by Michael K. Vaughan, where we play in the Western world, is coming to an end. We are riding into the sunset this one last time. I have been indulging myself on June on the Range. Absolutely no apologies whatsoever. I have been indulging myself because I waited all year. Assembled cheap old paperbacks, thought about it, got tons and tons of ebooks, and that was enhanced by the fact that I don't think I will read many Westerns between now and next June on the Range. I think I love the experience of these June on the Range events, but I'm not all that wild about Westerns. I know that sounds like heresy, especially after 2 years of June on the Range, but I love getting the spirit of it. I love the community and the fun and the playfulness of June on the Range, but I'm not going to have a call to read 130-page, 70-year-old, 35-cent Westerns during the rest of the year. I don't think I will. I certainly didn't experience that last time. Unlike, for instance, science fiction, which doesn't have a gigantic BookTube event. Sci-Fi July is the natural, euphonious possibility, but like everybody else, I'm terrified to use the word sci-fi to describe science fiction because I'm worried that Stephen E. Andrews will send me a box of scorpions in the mail. I'm supposed to call it SF, and nothing rhymes with SF. Science fiction, I get a yen to read that all the time. And murder mysteries, oh my, there's March Mystery Madness, which is 90 months away from now. But at least that's a big BookTube event dedicated to mysteries. I'm not confined by March Mystery Madness because I read murder mysteries all the time. I feel, in other words, the yen to read those things. I doubt that I don't usually feel a yen to read Westerns, mainly because when they were the most popular genre in the fiction world, publishers printed a lot of them. A lot of them. Millions of them. And when you're going to do that, your quality level is going to go down. And that is true. I have encountered that on June on the Range. I wish I could say this year that I was ending on a real diamond in the rough, a real discovered gem, but no. No, I'm not. I'm ending with this thing. Walt Coburn's Law Rides the Range. Kind of an interesting cover there. He's holding on to, that man must be wounded. He's holding on to the reins of that man's horse. He's not holding on to the reins of his own horse anymore. But maybe they're in his hand, maybe they're gathered together, and he's shooting at something. That horse right there looks like I do after wine and calzones have been flowing here at Hyde Cottage. This is from, when was this? 1935. And usually with June on the Range 2023, I have just assumed that the author wrote under lots of pseudonyms and wrote hundreds of books. Hundreds of them. Every time I lift up a rock in June on the Range for an author, I find that to be true. That the author is literally insanely prolific. To the point where I stopped even inquiring. But I inquired with Walt Coburn. It's exactly true. It's exactly right with him. He wrote hundreds and hundreds of books. The one book of his that I would really like to read, I've only read one, this one. The one book of his that I would really like to read, if I remember correctly, he wrote an autobiography. And I'd really like to read that. I bet that would be really interesting. God knows where it is or how I would ever find it. But I found this. And I read it. And it was, 150 pages. Let me read the back to you. When Wade Morgan killed influential Shotgun Riley in a gunfight and was forced to follow the Owl Hoot Trail to escape a bounty-hunting sheriff, he left his son Joe behind to face Bull Mitchell's renegade crew. Mitchell owned Pay Dirt, Montana, and the county officer's lock, stock, and barrel, but his position was threatened when Joe Morgan tacked up his lawyer's shingle and announced his plans to clean up the town. In the struggle that ensued, Joe was sided by a crusading newspaperman, a red-headed gambling girl, his father's old saddle pard, that's pardner, Long Bob Birch, and Wade Morgan himself, who galloped into the ruckus at the last minute with 6 sons singing a deadly song of doom. And hence you get the title, Law Rides the Range, which was the germ of something interesting in this book, because Joe Morgan intends to clean up the town legally. He himself is not a rootin' tootin' gunfighter. He's hanging up his shingle as a lawyer in order to announce to everyone in pay dirt that the law is sovereign. And Bull Mitchell does not want to hear that. He is actually threatened by that. And forces start to gather throughout the book. It takes a long time, but they do. And that idea hovers over a lot of Western novels, right? Given the timing, it hovers over a lot of Western novels. Westerns tend to take place, in terms of time, they tend to take place from the time period immediately after the American Civil War to the year 1900, to the beginning of modernity, to lighted streets and transcontinental railways and the extermination of the buffalo and the near extermination of the First Nations peoples. Over the books in that time period is what we know is coming. We know what's coming, right? It's the inverse of science fiction, where you don't know what's coming. In the Western, you do know what's coming. All kinds of Westerns deal with the idea that this life, good and bad, beautiful and sordid, is doomed. The reader knows it's doomed when you're reading. And it's going to have outliers. It's going to have encroaching tendrils. So it's going to have little bells of premonition of what's coming. Like, for instance, a buffalo hunter in a novel will find there are no more buffalo, that he has to look harder and harder for the herds. The First Nations peoples in these books will be more and more desperate as they see the handwriting on the wall and know that they are doomed to be penned up in reservations. That their old nomadic way of life, being free on the open plains to massacre each other, is about to come to an end. And so on and so forth. The railway. How many times have we seen in a Western novel that the railway is off in the background? People might be speculating. They might be making all sorts of quick money off a railway spur coming through their town. But in the background of all of those conversations is that the reader knows something they don't, which is that all of that is going to change their world. It's going to erase their world. And the same thing is true with a lawyer having the guts to hang up his shingle in an outlaw town. That I'll put up my shingle as a lawyer and you might shoot me dead. But the law is still coming. I'm just one tendril. I'm one outstretched finger, as Tolkien puts it. You can't stop that progress. Seldom do the characters in these books actually say that, because usually the hack who's pounding away on a manual typewriter in his underwear in his bedroom with a bottle of bourbon on the floor has at least enough self-awareness not to have his characters talk like they know how it's going to turn out. At least they have that much. So the characters very seldom say that the law is going to win here, eventually. Sometimes they do, but usually they don't. But the reader knows it. We know that Joe Morgan is on the winning side. He doesn't feel it, and throughout most of this book, you don't feel it either. The events throughout most of this book, he's the underdog. There are insurmountable forces against him, and only as you heard from that cover description, only a tiny little group of people who are willing to stand with him. I was hoping that more would be done with that idea, the idea of the inevitable victory of law and order, but it wasn't. And also I was hoping, because I read the back of the book before I read this thing, look at how the shape this is in, though. Perfect shape. I was hoping that the gimmick at the end of the book, where Joe's father, who is a rootin' tootin' gun shooter, he is an avatar of the naked, coercive violence of the Old West, just like Bull Mitchell is. The whole book, you are hoping for a father-son reunion, a last-minute riding in of the one-man cavalry, and a confrontation with Bull Mitchell that will be really, really satisfying. And almost unbelievably, considering how much experience Walt Coburn has in writing these kinds of books. He even had his own magazine, I think, solely devoted to reprinting his stuff. That's how productive he was. Hundreds and hundreds of books. Despite all of that experience, Walt Coburn actually provides all three of those climaxes, and none of them work. They're all boring. And, I know these things are 100 years old. Some of these things are 70, 80, 100 years old. And they are also writing about a time that is different from even the time when the authors were writing these things. So there are staples that you have to provide. There are signposts that you have to do. Characters have to talk in dialect or in some sort of visual representation of Western speak, pard and whatnot. And they do for large chunks of this book. They do a lot in a lot of other Western writers too. I don't think anyone ever makes it work. Even Louis L'Amour, who you'll notice, I wasn't going to bring this up, but you'll notice that June on the Range 2023 had two rules. Read a Louis L'Amour novel and read a Zane Grey novel. Otherwise, you're free to roam as you please. And in all this time, in all these books, I did not read a Louis L'Amour novel. And he's, to be fair, the only Western author that I would be tempted to read at some other point in the year. So I realize that there are gimmicks that you have to do. There are staples that you have to provide here. We've gone through a lot of them. This is basically proto-incel material. You are writing this for... maybe incel is going too far, but you are writing this for middle-aged middle manager at IBM, comes in from Scarsdale on the commuter rail, and his paunch is spreading and his hair is thinning and he's not sure that he loves his wife, but no one divorces, and he hates his kids and they hate him, and he's got 10 more years until he either makes partner or gets a gold watch, and he's not sure which of those things are going to happen, and pretty much one morning a month, if not more than that, he has a shooting pain in his left arm and sees spots in front of his eyes, but he's not telling anyone. These things were designed to provide escapist literature for that guy, which means that the protagonist will not have any of those worries. He'll have lots of other worries. He'll be beaten, he'll take beatings, he'll give them out, he'll do stints in prison, he'll end up on a gallows with a noose around his neck in a fraction of a second to free himself. And he'll have chaste, awkward relationships with young women. That's been the rule in almost every book that I've read for June on the Range this month. A couple of really good exceptions, but this one is not one. Oh no. Let me read you just a bit here. Let me read you an example of what I'm talking about, although I really could plunk down anywhere on this thing. Let's see here. Until this evening, I was low and blue and tired, like a groggy fighter. And the minute I felt his lips kissing mine, I knew that I would always love Joe Morgan. He was the first man in my life. He'd be the last. Poor little old kitten. Don't, Pete. I can't stand it just now. So when I came awake after taking the count, I did what I could to repair the damage. I sent Joe back to Amy. He'll feel like an idiot, and she'll always hate me, but they'll patch it up and get married, and she'll have his babies, and they'll sit in front of the fire and get a good laugh out of it all someday. You mean to tell me, kitten, that you wouldn't take Joe, even when he told you he loved you? Perhaps he was just swept off his feet, Pete. Amy's his girl. She's always been his sweetheart since they were youngsters. Their love is the comfortable kind, solid, without too much emotion. They wouldn't quarrel once in a green moon. They belong to one another. So I gave him back to Amy. What did you tell Joe? How did you make him willing to give you up? The truth now, kitten. It was easy enough. What's the most dangerous weapon a person can use, Pete? Ridicule, of course. And I used it. I laughed at him. I made him believe I was just playing with him, like I played with lots of other men who kissed me. I let him think, Pete, that it wasn't the first time I was willing to love a man, providing the price was right. Naturally, he took his hat and left. You did that, Kit? Asked Pete Smith, his voice harsh. You made him think you were a common woman who was for hire? You, my kitten, did that? You told that damn lie? Pete turned towards the door. Kit pulled him back. Don't, Pete. I know you won't go after Joe and bring him back to make me admit it. Make me admit I lied. I know I've hurt you as much as I've hurt Joe. But Pete, honey, it's just the one of the breaks. It was my last card, and I played it for an ace. Joe will never repeat what I told him. What if he did? It would only go a little ways further in strengthening suspicions of others. Who believes I'm really decent? You and Dad. And Dad's dead. Two things. One, Your ear was not deceiving you. She talks like a flapper. She talks like someone, like a young woman in the 1930s would talk. Uh, and two, it's the sexism that I'm talking about, the kind of double standard that is baked into so many of these. I want to call this a 35-cent Western, but you notice there's no price on this anywhere. So I guess that was just so somebody could, say these are $5 for $1 or whatever. It's par for the course with these kinds of things, but it doesn't happen with anybody else. The men in the book, Joe's father especially, are not all that worried about reputation. Now, you could say, well, that's not anachronistic. That's not sexism. That's just the way it was back then. I suppose there are Walt Coburn wrote a lot of books. I would hate to think that the women in all of those books are as perfunctory and comforting to that middle-aged male executive as Kitty is in this book. I don't know. I'm not going to go out of my way to read another Walt Coburn book. Considering how much he wrote, I'm kind of amazed this is the only one I think I've ever seen. But it bugged me. There are ways to do it that are different than this. I've encountered them from books that were just as old as this, or almost, in this June on the Range. So I'm not willing to say it's just a hard feature of the industry. But anyway, this is a really good plot. Someone with more energy in writing could have done a lot more with this. Maybe Walt Coburn could have. If he hadn't, the year that he wrote Law Rides the Range, by my count, he wrote 6 other books. That will tell on you. That is the end of June on the Range. I'm afraid to say we are ending June on the Range 2023 on a meh note. I'm just glad that it wasn't the only meh note. I reread Horseman Pass By. Oh my God, that is still glowing in my mind. And there were a few other books that I encountered, Day of the Gun, that were startling, that had the courage of their convictions, were beautifully done in places, really wonderfully done in places. Part of me is thinking I should have stuck with, what's his name? Raine, R-A-I-N-E. I have a lot of his books, and the one that I've read 2 of his, and I thought they were both hoots. But I didn't. I wanted to go afield and experience what was out there, and that's just the luck of the spin. It played against me with this one. But there's always June on the Range next year, and who knows? I might reprise. I might go back to Westerns sometime in the winter. We shall see. But anyway, that's it for June on the Range for 2023. I had a blast. I want to thank Mike for making me a co-host again this year. And I'd love to hear more from, just because the event is over doesn't mean we can't talk about it. If you're reading Westerns or did read them for June on the Range, I would love to hear what your experiences were. Those of you who don't make videos. I'd love to hear it. Feel free to flood me with comments like that. But anyway, that's it for June on the Range. A wonderful event. I'm going to have to retire this glorious thumbnail, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.